Welcome to the introduction about movement measurements. If you measure, you can manage. However, measurement can be complicated. We make it much more intuitive by recording a 3D avatar and digging out the XYZ coordinates that you can see on the left side here and simplifying them down to an instant set of numbers. When we evaluate posture, we start by identifying the ankles and then projecting a line vertically upwards against gravity midway between the ankles. This is called our reference point. When evaluating the hips, we expect people to stand within 2 centimeters either side of the midline. The shoulders 3 centimeters either side of the midline, and the top of the head 3 centimeters either side of the midline. This is what we considered optimal position, energy efficient, with good alignment from the frontal view. Some people might call this midline the plumb line. Following this, you can see different configurations of hips, shoulders and head, and from here you can define the person's postural type. From the side, we take the same mid-ankle position as our reference line. From the lateral view, we also adopt the plumb line approach. We draw the line at 2 centimeters forwards or backwards of the reference line for the hips, 3 centimeters for the shoulders, and 3 centimeters for the head. Once you've defined the configuration from the side of the hips, shoulders, and head, you can then define the postural type. When looking from the front and looking from the side, you need to consider what is normal. In terms of postural sway, Nasher investigated this back in 1989, and he showed that in bipedal stance or double leg stance, limits of stability are around 16 degrees sideways, mediolateral, and around 12 degrees forwards and backwards. Now what that means for us in terms of our center of mass measurement is that a shorter person will not travel as far as a taller person. So the sway area is expected to be larger for a taller person than a smaller person. Now let's look at static postural alignment or misalignment. If you look at the body as joints stacked on top of each other, and then the body weight or gravity projected through those joints, then you can see that if they're stacked on top of each other, the body is in a rather efficient position. However, if the hips go slightly forwards and the shoulders go backwards and the head goes forwards, then they're not in an efficient position any longer. There is in fact a tendency for the leg to rotate around the ankle joint. There is a tendency for the trunk to rotate around the hip joint. And there's a tendency for the neck and head to rotate around the base of the neck. Once again, we have the fixed position of the ankles, projecting up as legs to the hips. And in this case, the hips are off to the right-hand side by 1 centimeter. The spine line, which is the mid-hip to mid-shoulder position, continues to travel laterally to the right. And then the top of the head sits a little more vertical, but also off to the right of the midline. Now, if you look at those two configurations together, you can then see how we arrive at the position of the center of mass. This is not the center of pressure. This is the center of mass. That is, it's the net position of the body weight, which normally sits around the belly. In this case, the person is leaning to the right and leaning backwards, and therefore the position that the center of mass tends to occupy relative to the base of support is backwards and to the right-hand side. Balance assessment can be performed in many ways. One of the ways is to use a stabilogram. Generally speaking, it's done on a force platform and you measure center of pressure. With motion capture, you can measure center of mass. That is, where is the body weight in the body, not just the pressure on the floor. The measures we use in movement involve following the pathway of the center of mass over time. In the case of this single leg balance, it starts at the white dot and follows this black path, and then we measure the position where the person spends most of their time. The area that's occupied is considered a quadrant, and we break up the quadrants into anterior medial, anterior lateral, posterior medial, posterior lateral. And likewise for double leg stance. However, in this case, it would be posterior and to the right side. The sway path can often be convoluted. Sometimes it's mediolateral, sometimes it's anterior-posterior. What's important is to evaluate the sway area. We use some fancy mathematics to do this, as well as the displacement from the beginning to the end, which can be broken down into mediolateral components. In our case, we measure the mediolateral velocity, and the anterior-posterior, or the forwards and backwards sway. And in our case, we measure anterior-posterior velocity. When looking at bipedal balance or double leg balance, we're interested in how steady the person is with their eyes open. Our reference point begins at the ankles. We calculate the position of the ankles, and then we take the mid position and we project the ankles and the mid position forwards to approximate the position of the plumb line. This also corresponds with the mid foot, and the mid foot being approximate mid position of the base of support. Steadiness generally comes from having your center of mass in the middle of your base of support. The purple dot represents the center of mass, the white dot represents the start of the sway path, and the black line, which happens to be under the purple dot here, represents the sway pathway. Optimal weight distribution is clearly to have 50% on each leg. The center of mass therefore is centered in between the feet and not too far backwards and not too far forwards. The literature about knee reconstructions tends to suggest that anybody who has 45% on one side and 55% on the other hasn't completely recovered. We adopt the same standard. However, in normal populations, it's not unusual to see 45-55, particularly if they're sedentary, and we would recommend 60-40 as being cause for concern. The sway area, or the space occupied by the sway pattern, tends to be around 1 centimeter squared in young adult populations, and in elderly populations, that is 65 years or above, around about 3 or 4 centimeters squared. 3 seems to be the cutoff for fall risk in older populations, according to the literature. Sway velocity, or how quickly you move, and that could be in anticipation of losing balance or at the point of losing balance and recovering from that position, tends to show at 1 centimeter in young adults and 1 to 1.5 in the elderly. And this has been noted in the literature as a good way to determine if somebody has risk of falling. Single leg stance with eyes open involves the same characteristics in terms of sway pattern, center of mass, ankle joint, and estimated midfoot. Once again, ideally we want the weight distributed over the axis of the foot, which is typically described as mid-heel to second toe. Let me remind you that this is just an illustration, it's not to scale. What's most important is the relationship between these body parts. The sway area in single leg stance in young adults is typically 8 square centimeters, and in older adults it fluctuates between 10 and 18 according to the literature. 10 in more active populations and 18 in more sedentary populations. Likewise with sway velocity, the numbers are larger in single leg than they are in double leg balance. And adults have a sway velocity of 2 centimeters per second, and older populations between 3 and 4. To evaluate the squat, we're interested in alignment and the trajectories of various body parts. We have quite a clear protocol for evaluating the squat. First, we want to check that the feet are pointing forwards and that the person's wearing suitable clothing. Ideally, they're in their underwear and most body parts are exposed. We start by checking the line that is projected upwards from the foot. This becomes our reference line. Then we move to the knees, and in the double leg squat, we allow for 15 degrees of movement outwards, but we prefer 8 degrees of movement inwards. This would be considered optimal. Then there is a grey zone, in this case a yellow zone, between 15 and 20 degrees laterally and 8 and 15 degrees medially. Any medial movement that is more than 15 degrees is considered potentially problematic. And anything that goes more than 20 degrees outwards is likewise potentially problematic. We're interested in the knees travelling in straight lines. We're also interested in knees that do not cross over the medial border of the foot or the middle of the ankle or the reference line. The next thing we look at is the hips. The hips are expected to travel in a straight line. We accept hips that travel no more than 3 degrees in either direction. And with the shoulders, 2 degrees in either direction. Sometimes one shoulder moves more than the other, and that tends to imply that there's some rotation or lateral flexion in the trunk during the double leg squat. And then based on this, looking at the knees, the hips and the shoulders and how they behave in relation to one another, we can define the squat strategy. That is, what type of squat do they perform? The summary report, which is delivered to the client, is simplified. The green arrows are anything that is less than 15 degrees, and the red arrows anything greater than 15 degrees. When looking at the single leg squat, we follow the same protocol. However, there is a difference in our tolerances. Medial and lateral deviation from midline is 8 degrees, with normal variation somewhere between 0 and 15 degrees, and then potential problems from 15 degrees or more. We want the knee to be traveling in a straight line, and again, we don't want the knee to be traveling medial to the reference point. The same rules apply to the hips. We want them to travel in a straight line and less than 3 degrees. And the shoulders travelling in a straight line and less than 2 degrees. And finally, as with the double leg squat, we want to define the single leg squat strategy. The literature implies that some people have knees that go in, some people have knees that are straight but the hips go out, and some people have knees and hips that are straight but the shoulders bend to the side. And these are considered substitution patterns or compensation patterns. Just to give you a very brief illustration of what's possible to interpret from the results, if we look at the lady with the double leg squat, you can see that both squats are within 8 degrees. However, the right-legged squat has an unusual quality to it. It's like an S shape, and it's going out to borderline 8 degrees, which is perfectly okay. But the outward direction tends to imply that the knee is traveling outwards, and to do that it needs to be tibial rotation outwards or upper leg turning outwards. That may imply something happening at the foot or the ankle, or it might imply something happening at the hip. The hips are traveling at 0 degrees, 2 degrees, and the shoulders at 1 degree. So we're quite satisfied with the way things are progressing with the upper body. When we look at the single leg squat, you can once again see the quality of the squat here in this very erratic S-shaped curve. So the leg appears to be going inwards and outwards on its journey downwards and upwards. However, the numbers are not too dramatic. The hips are going to the right at 4 degrees, which we consider to be a little bit too much. And the shoulders, particularly on the right side, tend to be following the hips, and they seem to have the same sort of shape. In this case, the trunk seems to be moving a little bit to the left-hand side during the movement, but the net direction is to the right-hand side. If we look at the effect of having different squat styles, and people do have different styles, some very clear things come up. When you go down into the squat, you take with you your center of mass, which is in this position here. Something between the trunk and the lower limbs. And if it's in front of the ankle, then you will go into dorsiflexion and you will tend to travel forwards. Unless, of course, you press down with your feet and your center of pressure will move forwards and it will push the center of mass backwards in order to keep you in upright standing. The lower limb wants to rotate around the ankle. The upper leg wants to rotate around the knee. The trunk wants to rotate around the hips, and the head wants to rotate around the neck. The moment arm for the head on the neck is quite small, so there's not so much effort involved there. However, the moment arm is quite large for the trunk, particularly if the person has a big chest. Then the moment arm and the mass moving forwards will require the back and the glutes to do quite a lot of work. The moment arm for the knee and the center of mass of the upper limb, not to mention the body weight coming from the trunk, means that the thighs need to work, probably in combination with some contribution from the hamstrings. And then lastly, the lower limb has a tendency to rotate or torque around the ankle. In this case, the knee is traveling forwards and down. Forwards and down. So there is an anterior projection of the knee. And in this case, it means that there needs to be dorsiflexion of the ankle, and that can be limited by the joint, or it can be limited by some tightness on the back of the leg. And there isn't so much posterior movement in this case of the hips. It's mostly a vertical movement of the entire body. If I take the same illustration here and look at very small movements in the knees, I can show you what happens when you do something called the Roman squat. And in this case, you can see that when the person sits back as if they're sitting on a chair, the knee movement, anterior or forwards movement, is quite small. And the alignment of the body compared to the alignment of the body in an upright squat is quite different. The center of mass is a long way behind the ankle joint, and therefore there is quite a large moment arm, making it quite difficult for the quadriceps muscles to control this, and probably the muscles on the front of the shin or the tibialis anterior trying to hold the body up as well. So the net movement is very much backwards with the center of mass and not so much forwards. And the knee position relative to the foot is very, very different. And this is why people have a tendency to lean forwards when they go into this type of squat. If they're reluctant to flex the knee, they will bend forwards and give themselves the impression that they're squatting. Or if they tend to sit backwards, sitting into the Roman squat, they'll have a tendency to fall backwards, which is the case in the middle, and therefore they'll need to lean forwards with the trunk, putting a lot more load on the lower back and the glutes. In that case, the line of sight is lower than the line of sight of an upright squat. With movement testing, we're quite interested in knowing behavior of the squat with full ankle dorsiflexion. Therefore, we tend not to allow this type of squat during our testing, and we will ask people to repeat. If they cannot successfully perform this type of squat, then notification will come up on the report to say not enough data. In side bending assessment, we're particularly interested in symmetry. The first thing that we look for is symmetry in the distance reached by the fingertips. The second thing we look at is distance traveled by the shoulders in the vertical plane. The third thing that we look at is the distance traveled by the fingertips relative to somebody's body height. And 30% of height is considered the cutoff point. And then the fourth thing that we do is looking for any inconsistencies between the fingers and the shoulders and how they move in relation to one another. I.e., you want to know that the left shoulder travels a certain distance and can be compared to the left fingertips. If you see any inconsistencies between the left and right, that can be a false positive result.